In 1961, an aviator sighted something that, in theory, should never have appeared before human eyes. They were four absolutely regular openings, cylindrical wells, so exact that they seemed like planned work, not natural accident. The estimated depth varied between 350 and 550 meters, structures isolated from the rest of the world for about 2 billion years. And inside them? An environment that institutional science seems to prefer treating as if it didn't exist. This type of information was not supposed to have reached you. It is not tribal myth. It is not conspiratorial invention. It is a real place. It exists at this moment. It is in Venezuela. And what was found in its depths produced a rare type of reaction, a silence so great that it comes across as deafening. No convincing official explanation, almost no serious publication circulating, no effort proportional to the size of the discovery. In a moment, you are going to understand why. Sarisariñama is not just a lost mountain. It is an ancient rock massif, about 2 billion years old, part of one of the oldest geological formations on the planet. It is in Bolívar, in Venezuela, in one of the most isolated, inaccessible, and least studied areas of Earth. And it remained that way until 1961. That year, a pilot was conducting a routine mapping overflight when he perceived something impossible to ignore. 4 circular depressions, almost perfect, drawn in the landscape. Geometric shapes, delimited. The largest one received the name Cima Martel. Its depth was never defined with total precision. Its diameter, however, impresses, about 350 meters, large enough to completely swallow a cathedral. Since then, only an infinitesimal number of officially authorized expeditions has managed to descend down there, something around half a dozen in more than 6 decades. The first actual scientific incursion occurred in 1970, led by Amaury Laroche. 9 men, high-level technical equipment. They were not curiosity seekers nor adventure hunters. They produced documentation. They made observations. They elaborated a report. After that, almost everything ended up in poorly accessible archives. The Venezuelan state protects the area under strict environmental status. The reaction of the international scientific community? An uncomfortable mutism. And when a structure with 2 billion years is known, and still, almost no one seems willing to discuss it publicly, the question changes in nature. It is no longer, how was this formed? It becomes, what do they not want to be investigated? The official explanation is too straightforward for such an uncommon case. Collapsed sinkholes, water, erosion, sandstone, natural phenomenon, nothing more. The problem is that nothing there seems really simple. Because the rock of Sarisariñama is not banal sandstone. It is Roraima sandstone, associated with some of the most resistant formations on the planet. These layers emerged in the late Proterozoic, when Earth had a very different configuration from the current one. For water to sculpt something like that, it would not only take millions of years, we would be talking perhaps of hundreds of millions. But that is not the hardest point to swallow. The real problem lies in the degree of geometric precision of these structures. They are almost impeccable cylinders, extremely steep walls. In several sections, the inclination approaches the vertical, and they do not appear, on the expected scale, the typical traces of a gigantic erosive process, absence of large sediment deposits, absence of loose and crumbling edges, absence of chaotic marks, absence of the gradual depressions that water normally leaves when it corrodes a formation over long periods. The general aspect is disturbing. It does not seem like something merely worn away by time. It seems like something pierced through, sectioned, as if the rock had been opened. Explorers who actually were down there reported even stranger details. They speak of parallel marks along the internal walls, patterns too regular to be easily accepted as natural, but also too irregular for someone to admit, without consequences, an artificial origin. There is an even more uncomfortable piece of data. In Cima Martel, the stratification of rocks is predominantly horizontal, but certain vertical marks cross these layers without following deviations or natural planes of weakness. Under normal conditions, erosion should follow lines of least resistance. There, this does not seem to occur. Some geological studies that examined the crater edges observed another element out of pattern. The extremities do not behave like margins of a classic sinkhole. They do not present the irregularity typical of a progressive collapse. Instead, the contour is sharp, clean, hard, almost like a precise cut. Researchers who tried to deepen boulder interpretations encountered significant editorial barriers. The result is always the same. The questions remain, but robust academic answers do not appear. Inside Sarisariñama, there is something perhaps even more disconcerting than geology: exclusive ecosystems without known equivalents in any other region of the planet. We are talking about a kind of natural chamber isolated for immense times, practically without direct sunlight, without normal exchange with the surface, and still full of life. Not little life. Much, strange life. Life difficult to fit into comfortable categories. Depending on the opening analyzed, the fall was estimated between 350 and 550 meters in different surveys. The atmosphere at the bottom presents small differences in pressure. Temperature maintains itself surprisingly stable, around 19 degrees Celsius throughout the year. The place behaves almost like a closed system of thermal self-regulation. There emerge plants that defy simple classifications. Fungi with uncommon architectures, described by some researchers as molecularly distinct from well-documented forms. Insects that only appear in that environment. Organisms without equivalent records in other locations, or else bearing characteristics so archaic that they resemble lineages that should have disappeared long ago. The impression is that of opening a sealed container since a remote era and finding intact and functional a living fragment of Earth's deep past. Biologists who examined samples obtained in the expeditions reported genetic patterns indicative of extreme isolation. It would not be 10,000 years, nor 1 million. Certain evolutionary cycles suggested by the data would point to separations of tens of millions of years, and this clashes with the narrative that everything would be the result of relatively recent processes of hydric erosion. If the biological isolation is so ancient, the chronology of formation must be much more complex than the official version admits. Field reports include another element rarely incorporated into academic texts: sounds. Sounds coming from the walls, sounds from the dark interior. Not just random noises, patterns, rhythm, repetition. Personal documents from expeditions speak of echoes that resemble distant movements. Water running can produce noise, of course, but water, as a rule, is disorderly. What was described there seemed to obey cadence, as if there were sequence, as if there were response. Many of those who descended also mentioned an insistent sensation, difficult to verbalize, the impression of being observed by something hidden in the darkness. After the return, some members of expeditions would have presented behavioral changes. There were those who asked for removal far from the region. There were those who avoided the subject almost completely. In several cases, public reports were dry, superficial, bureaucratic. Already the personal records suggest another thing. Being in that place left deep psychological marks. If an environment like this exists down there, how many other closed biological compartments could remain hidden beneath the planet's surface? How many other worlds separated from the rest of the biosphere could be evolving in silence, out of reach of conventional taxonomy? And for what reason does almost no one demonstrate real interest in looking? There is another intriguing detail. Various ancient maps and historical narratives suggest underground networks connecting the tepuis of the region, not just in mystical language, but in almost practical descriptions. Indigenous reports and notes from 19th century explorers, including references associated with Jules Crevaux's travels around 1880, mention passages under the earth-linking areas like Roraima, Auyan Tepui, and Sarisariñama, not as religious fantasy, but as functional geography. Crevo recorded the idea of underground paths used by the Yequana in displacements. His diaries were preserved in European institutions, but remain read by very few. The dominant interpretation has always been the same: exaggerations of an old explorer. But what if they were not exaggerations? What if Sarisariñama is only the most evident opening of a much larger system extending for kilometers under the rock? The Yequana, indigenous people of the region, maintain very specific knowledge about Sarisariñama, and this knowledge seems to go beyond the field of allegory. They use the name Sarisariñama Tea, interpreted as the place where time does not run in the same way. Their spiritual leaders do not treat the area as just any place. There are protocols, safeguards, defined rites, signs to be observed, offerings to be made. For generations, Sarisariñama was preserved as sacred territory, not just by abstract devotion, but by a knowledge transmitted in a practical way. They acted like those who know a concrete risk. Researchers who worked with the Yequana recorded consistent narratives about entities that would inhabit the interior of the earth, not described as ethereal spirits, but as corporeal beings, tall, very pale, marked by an aging different from common humans. The most curious aspect is the consistency between geographically separated groups. This is not an isolated story repeated by a single clan. There are patterns, and according to reports, attempts to bring this type of content to academic environments encountered strong editorial resistance. When an entire people avoids a place for centuries, creates specific taboos for it, and establishes protection rituals before any approach, it suggests accumulated experience. It suggests memory. It suggests knowledge. The discomfort arises when this knowledge clashes with the models of modern scientific authority. Because accepting that indigenous traditions could contain empirically valuable observations destabilizes the hierarchy that defines who can speak with legitimacy about the real. The number of scientific papers published on Sarisariñama is absurdly small. In more than 60 years, there are only a few reference articles. One soon after the La Roche expedition, another on basic geology decades later, a study focused on more superficial ecology, and some recent surveys concentrated on topography, avoiding discussing the origin of the phenomenon frontally. Compare this with the number of publications on sinkholes in other countries. Thousands. Add to this the hundreds of studies on caves, underground systems, and collapse processes around the world. And then observe the contrast. Sarisariñama, one of the strangest places on the continent, remains almost without literature. Access is restricted, authorizations are frequently denied. Research projects run into legal, administrative, and logistical barriers. The official argument usually is the same: environmental preservation. There is never a lack of justification to keep distance, but the insistence on this raises another suspicion. One does not act like someone who still needs to discover what is there. One acts like someone who prefers that no one approach. There is also a recurring pattern in historical reports about explorers who passed through the region. Many return and afterwards practically silence themselves. Robert Schomburg, who was in nearby areas in the 19th century, had references to underground formations minimized by his contemporaries. Julien Duguid, after visiting the region in the early 20th century, almost did not mention Sarisariñama in his public reports, despite having circulated in the vicinity. The pattern does not prove everything, but suggests something important. Repetition should never be ignored. Repetition usually points to intention. In the end, perhaps the question is not even geological. Perhaps it is informational. Imagine that there exists there something capable of shaking entire foundations of what we tell about Earth's history. Something that forces revision about the emergence of life, about accepted chronologies, about ancient occupations, about what we consider impossible in certain periods. How does one prevent a theme like that from becoming central? By blocking access, by disqualifying testimonies, by ridiculing dissenting hypotheses, by isolating researchers, by cutting budgets, by transforming the subject into academic periphery. This script is not imaginary. It has already happened in other contexts. Discoveries that challenge stable narratives are rarely welcomed with immediate enthusiasm. When inconvenient evidence arises, the scientific system does not always respond with openness. Often, it reacts with slowness, extreme caution, and institutional resistance. Now imagine the scale of the problem if Sarisariñama really hides something larger than a rare geological phenomenon. It would not be just a punctual revision. It could require retelling entire chapters of Earth's natural history. And Sarisariñama, perhaps, is not an isolated case. There are other points in the same large geological province with anomalous depressions, uncommon marks and shapes difficult to accommodate in traditional explanations. Monte Roraima presents recesses and structures at the top that remain without complete consensus. Ollantaytambo also has strange formations. Not all have the same depth. Not all exhibit the same degree of exactness, but the similarity between them suggests pattern, not exception. In much of the Orinoco Basin appear structures that do not fit comfortably into the most accepted models. Almost always, access is difficult, controlled, or rarely encouraged. And repeatedly, institutional silence returns to impose itself. The true question, perhaps, is another. What is the dimension of all this? We are not necessarily facing a single localized geological enigma. We could be looking at a set of scattered anomalies, treated separately so that they never seem like a system. Sarisariñama would be only the point that called attention, because in 1961, a pilot saw from above what should not be seen. There is an even more delicate aspect that almost never enters public discussion. Some independent researchers suggest that Sarisariñama occupies a curious geographic position when compared to historical maps of places considered anomalous by certain archaeologists specialized in the subject. Cahokia in the United States, Stonehenge in England, Pumapunku in Bolivia, Nazca in Peru, and other sites less known to the general public. Places associated, in greater or lesser degree, to advanced knowledge of engineering, mathematics, celestial orientation, or spatial planning in eras considered inadequate for that. In this reading, Sarisariñama would not fit as constructed work, but as point of deliberate isolation, as a chamber, as a compartment, and, after someone sees this pattern, it becomes difficult to ignore it. There were academic discussions about Sarisariñama that, as far as can be determined, never converted into open and widely available publications. The absence of public documentation proportional to potential interest raises suspicions of suppression. Researchers who tried to advance over the area faced persistent obstacles, difficulty in financing, access restriction, bureaucratic slowness, editorial filters. When these factors repeat too much, they cease to seem accidental. They begin to seem like protocol. Now you know that Sarisariñama exists. You know that it is not invention. You know that it is there, in a controlled region, practically inaccessible. You know that a few teams descended and in many cases returned silent. You know that the local indigenous knowledge warned for centuries that that place was different. You know that official science, at least on a proportional scale, did not demonstrate the curiosity that the case would deserve. And you know that there is a recognizable pattern of omission, minimization, and containment. From here on, the problem is no longer the place, it is the question that it installs. Because once the right question forms, it does not go away easily. If this is really being kept at the margins, what else is also? How many other buried structures, ancient chambers, isolated ecosystems, vestiges of civilizations or forgotten technologies can exist below the soil, outside the mental map that we were taught to accept? How many closed compartments from eras remain waiting to be found? And for how long will it be possible to keep all this away from public debate? Understand, the simple fact that you are taking knowledge of this is, by itself, disconcerting. This type of content does not usually circulate widely. It should not fall into the common flow of information. If it reached here, perhaps some barrier has failed, and if it failed once, it could be failing at other points as well. Now, you carry the notion that there exists a place to which you probably will never have access. A place that perhaps contains answers that will never be delivered transparently. A place that, silently, may influence the narratives that you were trained to consider definitive. And meanwhile, at some point in the present, someone may be descending down there. Someone who will see more than you will ever see. Someone who perhaps discovers the truth. And who, upon returning to the surface, perhaps does what so many others seem to have done before. Choose silence. Because silence has always been safer than truth. And perhaps it continues to be. What you have seen until here may be only the edge of the problem, the beginning, not the end. If this story already seems too large to fit in the official explanation, imagine what is still out of focus. The mystery does not end in Sarisariñama. Perhaps it is there only that it begins.